My throat was thick and dry when I answered the phone call finally from Sergeant Calloway. He darted off a series of questions and commands. He asked me where was my firearm, why haven't I answered the phone and come outside. My head was foggy, my heart was pounding, my legs were sweaty under my long summer purple dress. And I hear somebody cut him off and say, "You need to ask her if she's okay." That familiar voice was my sister. I swallowed and sobbed no. The next steps were for me to explain to him how I was going to exit my own home safely. I said, "I'm coming out, okay?" He said, "Okay." I said, "With my hands up and my black cell phone in my right hand, okay?" He said, "Okay." I said, "Don't shoot me, okay?" He said, "Okay." I walked towards the front door, and I was scared because I didn't know what to expect, so my hands are shaky and sweaty, and I opened up the door, and the dense summer steamy heat engulfed my face, and the cool air was sucked out from behind me. And I'm standing in the doorway with my hands up, and my heart is racing from shock. The entire street was closed off from left to right with a sea of patrol officer cars with officers slightly bent down beside them. That was August 1st, 2010. And that is the day that I was never considered another victim, but I became a survivor defendant. For the first 7 years of my life, I grew up on a military base. My father was in the Army, and when my parents would separate and get divorced, my siblings, my mother, and I moved back to Jacksonville, which is their hometown. Now, being a new kid on the block would present its challenges, and it was a culture shock too. But nonetheless, I had an older brother, and I followed after him quite a bit. And I was a tomboy. I loved sports. I played basketball, I played baseball, I played touch football with the boys, and I even did taekwondo. I managed to do all this wearing glasses and getting picked at and called four eyes. But it didn't matter because I ended up beating them anyway. I always knew how to stand up for myself at a young age. And I also did this for friends and other people if I felt like they weren't being treated fairly or if something wasn't right. As I would continue on to school, I would do the same thing. And if I had a question for clarity or understanding with authority, I had no problem asking. Now, that got me labeled as defiant. You see, my shyness was misunderstood, but when I spoke up, I was characterized as obstinate. I managed to find some balance between my teenage development and my natural leadership once I got to high school my senior year. During this time, I met a young man who had graduated 4 years prior, and he was a family friend of a friend. He didn't mind me being who I was, and he loved the fact that I wore baseball caps. Pretty simple. We ended up dating, we married, and we had our twins. We focused on our careers, and we focused on continuing our education. Our priority was to build a better home for our family. But what wasn't a priority was our marriage. And so insecurity and immaturity and inexperience got in the way. We did not have the proper skills that are required to maintain a marriage. We were young, so we ended up separating. We divorced, but we remained good friends. So now here I am in my mid-20s, married, divorced, great set of twins, and I'm still very ambitious about my career. So I was promoted to a management position where I led a team of 13 direct reports. During that time, I went back to school and earned my master's degree in business to complement my IT degree. My team was performing well. I loved what I did. I had a great set of twins who were doing well in school. They were in extracurricular activities. My daughter did gymnastics. My son played football. And I had a great co-parenting relationship. I could say I was living my best life. Sometime after that, senior management went through some changes. And during this time, I started to get feedback from other coworkers and colleagues. And they would stop me in the hallway and say, "Are you okay?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, I'm good. I'm just thinking." And so I started to receive more feedback like this until one day, my director called me into the office and he said the same thing from senior management. Now imagine, this wasn't about performance. was about my expression and not smiling. I had appreciated the woman that I had become. I was a mother, a friend, a leader, and to hear that generated a spark of insecurity, something like what I was told when I was younger. In my perception, I was kind, hardworking, reliable, a bit introverted, straightforward. I was fair, and I definitely had a sense of humor. But my perception was not reality. The message I received was, you're not good enough. And I had to be good enough. In fact, I had to be better than good enough. So I set out on a journey of self-discovery, because apparently I didn't know who I was, and I needed fixing. So I would just do the opposite of what I did before. And then I'd be perfect, right? But what happened is I allowed for them to shatter my self-esteem and shake my confidence. And that was the setup in the beginning of me giving up my power. During this time, I met a guy I'm starting to date again. He was funny, he was charismatic, outgoing, very attentive and caring, and we had some things in common. We both were single parents. We started doing everything together. Stuff took off a lot faster than I planned, the honeymoon stage. But quickly and subtly, the attentiveness and care turned into possessiveness and jealousy. It didn't feel good, but I didn't have the language to describe what it was. So I shrugged it off and thought maybe he had some trust issues, and all I had to do was prove that I was trustworthy, and then he would catch on and we would be okay. Meanwhile, the new Marissa is definitely extremely friendly, more compliant. I'm not conforming for social acceptance in an environment where diversity and individuality is not tolerated. Oh yeah, and I'm definitely smiling more. But it was difficult for me because I had to appease other people and sacrifice my own comfortability. The one thing I never doubted was my intelligence. I was able to grasp concepts pretty quickly. I was emotionally intelligent, I was aware, and to hear that at the height of my career was pretty devastating. We continued in our relationship, and at some point, he became physically and verbally abusive. Now, initially, I didn't consider it to be that bad. I convinced myself somehow that it wasn't that bad, that it wasn't occurring that often. I mean, when it was good, it was great. But when it was bad, it was so awful. I felt like I was walking around on eggshells, like I was on guard all the time. Over the next few months, I endured the cycle. Tension, abuse, reconciliation, peace, and then repeat. And yet I still hadn't identified myself as a person who was a victim of domestic violence. I had become so immersed in the shame and judgment of being that woman. How could I be that woman? I finally stopped lying to myself and admitted this was domestic violence. One night, he became violent and the police were called and he was arrested. A no contact order was issued at the time of the arrest. I would later then go and put a permanent order of protection in place. But I had fell into a moral dilemma, and that was pursue the case and he get convicted and be separated from his kids, or allow for the permanent order of protection to stay in place and not participate in the criminal charges. The charges were dropped, the permanent order stayed in place, and so I'm protected, right? Well, at least that's what I thought. You see, I longed to have a relationship with the person that I met, and that was the goal. I really wanted to not be a failure in relationships. I wanted to put forth the effort to show that if we could overcome anything or any issues that we had in the past. I mean, because let's just face it, in the beginning, it was refreshing, and I was trying to get that back. I was still pretty optimistic about us having a future. So whenever he called apologizing and remorseful, I guess you can say we moved towards some form of reconciliation. So we're back to being good, so good that I become pregnant. We would certainly not feel it at this time, especially if I could just eliminate the violence. My gesture for peace was to have the no contact order modified, but leave the no violent contact in place. And surely this would help us grow together. I mean, now I am carrying his child, and we definitely have to have contact if we're going to make any hopes of a future and move toward that place of reconciliation. However, this did not happen, and I further continued to subconsciously yield and make excuses which further reinforced his behavior. One morning, my co-parent sent me text messages of our 10-year-old twins celebrating their birthday. They were on vacation. I had just given birth to my baby girl. It was 8 days prior, and she was premature, and she was still in the hospital fighting for her life. So I would go out there to the hospital. She was finally able to get a bath, and I was able to give her her first bath, and she smiled for the first time. So I took a whole lot of pictures. The next day, I gave him my phone to look at the pictures, but instead, he looked at my text messages, and he flew into a jealous rage, verbally and physically assaulted me, and then threatened to take my life. I never felt so much terror in my life. And that assault and threats finally came to an end when I fired that one single warning shot. Just when I thought that I was breaking the shackles of psychological abuse by defending myself, I had no idea that I would be shackled and become one of the growing number of survivor defendants. I didn't know it at that time, but 75% of women are murdered by their intimate partners or are killed when they attempt to leave the relationship or after they've already left the relationship. By the end of the day, 4 women will die at the hands of an intimate partner. For many women, ending the cycle of abuse means choosing between life and death or prison and freedom. I was arrested, charged with aggravated assault with no intent to harm. Eventually, I was convicted, prosecuted, convicted in 12 minutes and sentenced to 20 years in prison. I did not commit aggravated assault, but aggravated assault took place. He aggravated and assaulted me for months. When I fired that warning shot, it was for survival. I knew at that moment that I had to respond in a way that would allow for me to stay alive and be there for our children for the rest of their lives. But for so many women, that's a turning point. Women are the fastest growing population in prison by 700% increase since 1980. Many women report some form of abuse, sexual or violent abuse, prior to incarceration. If the violence is unabated, we risk losing our lives. If we defend ourselves, we risk losing our freedom. I'm a mother of 3. I was a successful businesswoman, like many of you in this room, or somebody you may know who's a professional, an educator, a doctor, a lawyer, a student, and yes, even first ladies of churches who suffer in silence like I did. Ironically enough, while I was awaiting pretrial in 2011 in jail, the CEO of the very company that I worked for 10 years, a decade, ended up having to resign because he had a domestic violence charge against his wife. This is the debilitating reality for so many women and men. But with knowledge, we can regain our power. And that's exactly what I set out to do when I fired that single warning shot. I stand before you today an empowered survivor defendant. A survivor defendant is a person who at that time they were charged with a crime, was or is a victim of a violent act, and were a significant contributing factor in the crime for which they are prosecuted. There are many more like me across the country, studies and researchers have showed. The outcries for my case sparked local activists and campaigns to be started, like Free Marissa Now, Survive and Punish, Love and Protect, just to name a few. I share my personal truth in hopes of helping someone who has similar circumstances not make the same choices I did and expect a different outcome. We must educate people about the signs and red flags of abuse and make a pledge to violence-free relationships. You must obey all warning signs because a lot of us want to see who a person can be and neglects who they are. It is not our responsibility to change a person. It is solely up to them. What is our responsibility is to advocate on our own behalf of how we want to be treated, and that's like human beings. Please do not put yourself at the mercy of the criminal justice system. With proactive prevention and education, we can end intimate partner violence. Otherwise, it's like me, and it was a crime for me to survive. Thank you.